Hello everyone. Today I would like to talk about the media and the barriers of state, capital and platforms against journalistic practice. Journalism in the wider media landscape is often considered an important and fundamental pillar of modern liberal democracies, so much so that it is referred to as the fourth estate to ensure checks and balances are met within the halls of power. The ostensible watchdog role of the media has, however, been deeply criticised and questioned, with trust in the media seeming to decline further on a global scale. While much of this distrust of the mass media is likely to be mired under accusations of fake news and misinformation, with different applications and meanings depending on which direction they're coming from, those buzzwords have been comprehensively covered since their popularization during the US elections in 2016. A more critical examination of the media, including its role in society, and how that is carried out in practice, is perhaps better served by viewing journalistic practice through the lens of the overarching systems of power and connectivity in the current era. This essay does not intend to defend the notion of the media as the fourth estate. To the contrary, it will be argued that within the current systems of state, capital, and digitization, the mainstream media landscape is simply unable to carry out that task to any meaningful degree. In fact, it is instead often used by the powers of state and capital as a tool to pursue their own interests. This essay will begin with a brief discussion of what journalism is and does. That will be followed by a deeper dive into the media, relying on theory and historical and contemporary examples to show how state, capital, and digital platforms have shaped and controlled the scope and role of the media. This foundation will then be applied to foreign policy reporting, with an analysis of how the state, focused on Australia, has been actively hostile against critical media. Finally, it will conclude with some comments and suggestions for the future of journalistic practice beyond the current paradigm. Defining journalism is an important cornerstone for realizing its current purpose and potential. The proclaimed social purpose of journalism is enabling the public to assert meaningful control over the political process by providing them with the information needed for the intelligent discharge of political responsibilities. Similarly, Shower defines the role of journalism as informing people on factual matters relevant to their civic duties, explaining and clarifying those facts by putting them in context, providing a check against abuses of power by probing behind the curtains of government, commerce, and other public enterprise, and providing a venue for discussion and debate. Others frame it as reporting done in the public's interest, with rigorous debates as to what exactly the public interest entails. For the day-to-day practice of journalism, these are sufficient definitions, but a deeper understanding of how these purposes are or are not carried out requires taking a longer view, that is, history. Robert Fisk, a foreign correspondent who reported on many conflicts around the world, viewed his reporting and writing as a first draft of history, documenting events and placing them within their relevant contexts. Framing journalism, particularly political and conflict reporting, as itself historically significant, allows us to analyze and critique journalism and journalists as one would history and what is written of history. The definitions provided above are primarily centered around the distribution of facts, of information, but facts are only part of the story. As E. H. Carr put it in What is History, facts are the raw materials available to us, and that not all facts of history are historical facts. By this he is referring to the choices of the historian to include, omit, or, unwittingly or not, be entirely unaware of the available facts of history. This, then, becomes a constant dialogue between past, present, and future, with different publics providing new insights and different interpretations and reinterpretations of the same facts. Shaped by their societies, the work of historians, no matter how objective, is framed entirely within their biases and interpretations, and as such ought to be approached critically. Applying this to contemporary journalism, journalists and commentators as writers of the first draft of history have an immense responsibility to determine what facts become news, and are thus susceptible to the same pitfalls as a historian, if not perhaps more so. Carr himself notes this, saying that every journalist knows today that the most effective way to influence opinion is by the selection and arrangement of the appropriate facts. The rest of this essay will be centered around the idea of the appropriate facts, including how, why, and by whom they are designated as such. Herman and Chomsky's critique of the media is that its role is the opposite of the posited definition. to inculcate and defend the economic, social, and political agenda of privileged groups that dominate the domestic society and the state. This is evidenced in the historical record through the birth of the bourgeois class and the actions of colonial powers during the Industrial Revolution and colonial periods. For instance, Patching and Hearst answer the question of why a number of early papers and news sheets backed certain revolutionary movements against monarchies rather simply. They were representing those who wished to overturn the social conditions in such a way that their dominance over the political and economic systems of liberal capitalism was assured. This included the American press, which later supported the American Revolution, being funded through the advertising and brokerage of the slave trade while espousing the lofty ideals of liberty leading up to 1776. In Tasmania during the 1800s, Brodie describes the liberal and conservative papers' views on the removal of the indigenous population to ensure the security and expansion of the white colony. On one hand, the population could be forcefully relocated to the islands off the coast, while on the other, they could merely be exterminated. Both options, quite obviously, did not consider or represent the views and autonomy of said indigenous population. In the early 20th century, the terms propaganda and the manufacture of consent, as discussed by Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann respectively, were openly touted as necessary for the functioning of democracy. Bernays, for instance, assisted the United Fruit Company and the US government in the creation and distribution of propaganda to journalists as they rallied against and ultimately overthrew Guatemala's democratically elected government under Jacobo Arbenz in 1954 for the crime of agrarian reform. Herman and Chomsky borrowed Lippmann's phrase manufacturing consent for the title of their book on the mass media, laying out a model of how the media was inherently propagandistic, including its rather muted role reporting on the invasions and bombings on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia that killed millions to the US public. Coincidentally, it was also the first time journalists were embedded within the army, a trend that only accelerated in the War on Terror decades later. Cynical irony aside, this tenuous yet entrenched relationship between state, capital, and the press has been built in since the start. Kara and Lau's discussion of meaning-making encapsulates this perfectly, noting media, including journalism and the mass media, is a social process whereby people interact with others to construct a view of reality. They cite Gramsci's hegemonic struggle, whereby the ruling elites of the day must work to build and maintain their hegemonic dominance by managing the interests of the public. This includes the newsroom, where the media's focus as a business moved to building a mass audience that could be sold to advertisers and circulating appropriate discourses that benefited them and their shareholders. The organizational practices and culture of a newsroom are enforced from the top, and through filtering and naturalization, over time they are unquestioned and seen as not constraints on the work of reporting news, but as simple routine. As a major source of creating and distributing meaning onto the facts of the world, it is little wonder that media ownership has practically monopolized on the corporate giants and that regulation is strongly opposed by media companies. In Australia, this concentration of media outlets and companies has steadily increased. In 2018, following the Turnbull Coalition government's deregulation of media ownership laws heavily pushed by Nine and News Corp, Nine merged with Fairfax, severely compromising any independence by subsequently hosting a Liberal Party fundraiser and with the Sydney Morning Herald consistently supporting the Liberal Party in the New South Wales state elections in 2019 and 2023. What Pusey and McCutcheon said of Howard's 2006 changes still resonates today. It is little surprise, then, Fourth Estate values, editorial independence, and the larger priorities of moderate democratic governance largely have been subordinated to a pressure for market deregulation that has advantaged private against public interests and the interests of the citizen against those of the consumer. The constraints go well beyond the corporate organizational structure and motives of the mass media, however. In the digital age, platforms hold significant power over the editorial practices and revenue opportunities of media outlets. Platforms such as Google or Facebook have made staggering profits off of advertising through published news content, and many online outlets have had to adapt to either networked or native strategies, or a mix of both, to try and generate revenue of their own. There are two major concerns for journalism with the rise of platforms. The first is simply the deluge of information and its counterpart, mis/disinformation. In this context, disinformation is not referring to false information, but information that loses meaning. Lash, writing in the context of print media and the beginnings of the modern internet, talks about the information society and news being written immediately, without reflection, for that day, under pressure of a deadline, of no use tomorrow, of value for 24 hours and no longer. This has grown exponentially with the immediacy and connectivity of the internet and social media, with a new generation of purely digital and entertainment outlets pumping out droves of content with the intent of at least some of it becoming viral. Second, this allows platforms and the algorithms they are run on to directly and indirectly influence the type of content that is produced and distributed on them. One way this is done is through the growing increase in clickbait journalism, a trend not isolated to misinformation or conspiracy outlets, but deeply connected to attention metrics for legacy media as well. Another effect, closely related, is the editorial decisions about what news is published about a particular topic, country, or interest. For example, news about K-pop is more likely to perform far better for a Western audience on social media than an article about local politics in Korea. As news outlets try to cater to this ever-changing platform landscape, they are not only competing against a proliferation of unoriginal reporting and content being generated and shared, but also the economic imperative and radical indifference platforms like Facebook and Google have that allow fake news and misinformation to be presented in similar ways to genuine news reporting. The state, while in many ways beholden to the same corporate interests that own or have a hand in many of the mainstream media outlets, also has its own way to keep journalism, particularly social justice or activist journalism, in check. Foreign affairs, including conflict reporting and national security, are ideal topics for illustrating these methods, because they have both individual and global repercussions in the journalism sphere. National security in particular is a major contention for public interest journalism, as the public interest does not always correlate with what is touted as the national interest, and because it is used as a shield and weapon by the state as required. 9/11 and the desire to suppress whistleblowers are two major catalysts in this respect. Free speech in general, but also in journalism, has faced a chilling effect as a result of increased surveillance of online activity following 9/11. On the flip side, raids against journalists carried out by the Australian Federal Police, such as those carried out against the ABC in relation to the Afghan files, and prosecutions against whistleblowers such as Witness K and Bernard Collaery, are essentially intimidation tactics employed by the state to discourage future revelations. Another attack on the press, specifically the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, came in 2003 in the wake of the Iraq War. The Howard government, which led Australia into the illegal invasion of Iraq as part of the Coalition of the Willing, made clear their opposition to critical reporting on the war. Amidst general accusations of leftist bias and anti-government sentiment, which was hardly new at the time and is still levied at the public broadcaster today, then Communications Minister Richard Alston launched a campaign against the ABC's coverage of the Iraq War, submitting 68 complaints to the Complaints Review Executive. Only 2 of these complaints were upheld, and more were upheld in subsequent and arguably questionable reviews, but as Passetti notes, this had clear implications for the independence of the ABC, as Howard threatened the outlet's budget. One justification given for this hit at the ABC is the concept of the middle ground, that it is ostensibly meant to adhere to. A middle ground, Passetti explains, that shifted in the eyes of the government as they swung more to the right. In 2004, John Martinkus, an independent journalist who worked for the SBS, was freed by insurgents in Iraq. The reasons provided for his release, as opposed to being killed as others had been, and comments made upon his return to Australia based on his time in Iraq, made him a target for then Foreign Affairs Minister Alexander Downer. As a journalist critical of the American occupation, Martinkus believed his captors had released him because they did not view him as an enemy. Downer's accusations, picked up by others in Parliament and in the media, suggested he was a terrorist sympathizer and that he was playing right into their hands by declaring that Iraq was not recovering. Both of these were lies, with Martinkus in no uncertain terms stating the actions of the terrorists were unjustifiable, and Iraq's reconstruction being an abysmal failure militaristically and economically for Iraq. Reporting seen as critical of the state or sympathetic to the enemies of the state was seen as a threat and something that needed to be discredited. Numerous outlets in Australia, the US, and the UK had, in the lead up to the war, supported the blatant lie that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and had ties with Al-Qaeda and other extremists. But to question that narrative or to humanize the Iraqis in any way, whether they were terrorists or not, was labelled dangerous. Mentioning the West's support and provision of chemical weapons capabilities to Iraq during the war with Iran in the 1980s doesn't bear a mention. That's old history. The powers of state and capital have had deep entanglements with journalism from its earliest iterations. The rise of the internet and digital platforms have had immensely disruptive and equally influential impacts on journalistic practice in the 21st century. If journalists wish to uphold the ideals that the field claims to possess, then challenging those three pillars will be necessary. Outlets such as the Washington Post being owned by Jeff Bezos, or platforms like Twitter being purchased by Elon Musk, are some blatant examples of how corporate interests intervene in the media landscape. Similarly, media moguls such as Rupert Murdoch have vast enterprises across the Western world, and there is certainly a connection between those outlets reporting, or outright denialism of, global warming and Murdoch's own investments in the fossil fuel industry. In a constant drive for false balance, corporate interests have been highly active in swaying media debates for decades, often with detrimental outcomes for the public. This must be challenged for contemporary journalistic practice to become sincerely independent. Digital platforms also need a rethink, with the profit motive and data collection negatively impacting the quality of journalism being produced and shared, while also spreading viral misinformation. News systems ought to be designed with the ideals of a digital and information commons, where news is a public good for genuine public values, rather than a commodity to be marketed. Public investment through governments and/or citizens and communities is also a worthwhile venture, as it not only allows the populace to remain informed, but removes the barriers presented by cost and reach these platforms present. Solutions for overcoming the threats of the state towards journalism and transparency will not be simple or easy either, but it is clear that the increase in secrecy and the fervour with which perceived dissent is hounded is not conducive to a free press. Injustices propagated by the state against any group of persons and those who report on it need strong opposition, and transparency and accountability need to become cornerstones of journalistic practice when reporting on political matters. The patriotic streak of embedded journalists, for instance, or the breathless support for increased militarization in the Pacific, should be deeply questioned by journalists who truly wish to maintain a modicum of objectivity. Contemporary journalistic practice has much potential beyond the current paradigms. From its origins, journalism has always been a first draft of history, but as such it has always been victim to the same pitfalls and societal factors that history has been. Untangling itself from the mix of history, state, capital, and now digital considerations won't be a simple task, but as many of the examples provided above hopefully illustrate, it will be a necessary step for journalism to take if it wishes to remain the genuine public good it claims to be. Its survival against the various threats and barriers will depend on the willingness of journalists to take on this more critical stance. The alternative is to continue down the current path of struggling adaptation and complacency.